Hey everyone, Johnny from Jedel here, and welcome to another episode. Today I'm joined by Luke, who is joining us from ANU. Luke, thanks so much for being with us today.
Oh, my pleasure to be here, Johnny.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to have you on. You did incredibly well last year. Luke's duxed his school. He got ATAR of 99.90. Who state ranks in history? So we've got a history expert on here today. And I'm sure, well, we should just say an all-rounder because he did incredibly well across all of the subjects. But third in ancient history, seventh in modern. That's a really impressive achievement. So thank you for being on again. And let's kick off by just going through what you've been up to since you actually got those results.
So in the wake of getting those results, obviously, I think some celebrations were in hand. And even just with all my friends, having the weight off your shoulders of having, not only just finished the exams, but also got the final result and know what's going on in the future. In that time, lots of going out, seeing my friends, and especially meeting new people now. I'm at ANU in O week. So we've had a really jam-packed, somewhat exhausting week. And just now doing some of my readings for my law courses and my arts courses, and getting ready to start lectures and shoots, which will be on from this week.
That sounds fun. And what goes on at O week, like especially at a place like ANU where it's got a little bit more of that college vibe, right, as opposed to Sydney Uni or UNSW, UTS. What's the setup like, and what's going on down there?
Yeah, so it's really good, as you mentioned. At ANU, every first year has a guarantee of on-campus accommodation. So most people find themselves living either in one of the uni's residential halls or in a uni lodge. And what that means is Canberra really comes alive because you have like 20,000 uni students all turn up for O week, and there's some events hosted by the student union at ANUSA. And then there's also some events hosted by individual residential halls. And for example, my hall had a theme. We had rodeo week, hence why I have an Akubra up right there. That was lots of fun, and do things like there's activities during the day. You get to experience, see lots of different clubs and societies which you might want to join. I think I've already joined like 8 or something, which was very inadvisable because I won't be able to do all of them, but still
ambitious.
That's what O week's for. I guess just meet people and start making friends.
No, that sounds like a lot of fun, man. It's certainly a unique experience going to uni, especially if you're going to go to somewhere that has a college environment like that. I only kind of tasted that when I went on exchange in America, and obviously like America is kind of the home of that college setup. And I just remember how much fun that is. So I'm sure you're going to have an amazing time. It's a time where you're going to make a lot of friends. And I think that's one of the things that can be overlooked when people think about uni. They think, oh, it's, I just have to go and do more study, etc. But when I think back to it, it really was just a great social time. And it's that's like the number one benefit. It's that. And of course, doing courses that you enjoy by the end, at least. And what I mean by that is, you might start with courses that you don't like that much, and then you drop them. And as long as you end up doing something that you're enjoying, I think that's a big win, because you've eliminated a lot of things that, from your kind of realm of possible, career paths, etc. So it's cool to be able to get a feel for different subject matter, but also the social side, I think, is something that's really critical to your time at uni. And that's why I think what you're doing is really cool, because you're getting the full immersion. And I'm envious of that. So that'll be a lot of fun for you. Now, when we think back to the HSC last year, or when you think back to it, what kind of comes to mind when you think back to the day you finished your last exam? Run us through what happened that day, that night, to the extent you can, and then run us through the day that you got your results.
The day I finished my last exam. My last exam was Latin Continuers. And I remember that's a tough one because it's long. It's 3 hours, and you do 3 sections, and there's just lots of Latin. It's the exam that really I love Latin, but it really drags you to the end of your attention span or focus. And so after that, luckily I had some other friends who had finished on that day, and so we all just met up, went out, had dinner together, and just sat back and had a relaxing evening. And maybe, I think I got home really late, probably the latest since the start of the HSC or something. and slept in the next morning and woke up and just felt pretty good. And then on the day I got my results. That was very interesting. I tried to sleep through it, but I'm naturally a morning person. And so I think I woke up at the HSC results came out at 6 and I woke up at 6:12 or something, even though I specifically not tried to set an alarm or anything. And so I woke up and I'd had the night before, I'd had all these dreams about rolling over and picking up my phone and looking at the results. And then like it actually happened. I opened, I went, oh my gosh, that's pretty good. And I was fairly happy with the numbers I saw there. Obviously didn't know what they translated to in terms of an ATAR. Funnily enough, my mum mentioned that she saw someone had put out like a desk or something, a council cleanup. And I just was so elated that I went down in my dressing gown, like skipping down the street and looked for that desk. But that was just irrelevant. And then I came back into my home and, texted some of my friends, talked to some of my friends. And then by then it was almost, had breakfast. By then it was almost 9. And I then opened up my ATAR. And so that was very happy. And then it's kind of a blur. I know that evening I definitely saw some of my friends again. I think we had also a mini family celebration. So we had just with my immediate family, so with my brothers and sisters. And then I went out with some friends again, just to see each other. And again, have dinner.
And it sounds like it was, it was very well deserved. So I'm sure that was a really joyous time. And was there a period after where there was any sense of feeling a bit like deflated, whether it was even after the exams or after the results? I just wonder whether, people think, oh, you must be on such a high, and I'm sure you were, but does it also come with a kind of deflationary or not deflated period, I should say, where you're a little bit not lost or anything, but like you've just exerted yourself for like a year and there's kind of this down to it? I wonder, did you have anything like that?
Yeah, kind of, because I was always going to go to ANU, I guess. I already had the early entry and everything, which was really good. And so in the end, I got the mark, and one of my first thoughts was, well, that doesn't change much or change anything. And then, I briefly considered like, oh, maybe I should change it up. But then I thought, no, the best option that I saw was going to ANU because of the opportunities it provided me. And so there was a bit of that, a moment of, oh, wow, now that it's here, it doesn't seem to mean much, which doesn't make sense because, I guess it was a fulfilling year for me in general, and I enjoyed my subjects and everything, the rest of it. But it wasn't long lasting, because I think there was also, I had a similar thought during year 12 where I thought, why did I work during year 11? Because that didn't matter for anything. And I remember one of my history teachers, my modern and extension teacher, she told me, like, be serious, Luke, you're always going to work because you're driven in that way in terms of finding that sort of achievement. And so that was actually surprisingly a helpful thought when I got the mark, and I was like, oh, wow, it doesn't change my life at all. But then I thought, but then again, I was always going to do that. And I enjoyed it on the whole.
Yeah, that's it. So it's the enjoyment of the process, but also from a self-esteem point of view, I think it's important as well to know that you gave it your all and that you didn't leave anything on the table. And that in itself is the most rewarding part of it, I think, which is why it does make sense what you're saying. Like, you got the mark and you're like, oh, so what? And yeah, there's a moment of like, wow, that's a great reflection of my year. But I think the real fulfillment comes from knowing you kind of left it all out on the table throughout that whole year. It's the process there. But it's nice for it to be capped off by, a mark or something objective that kind of correlates to that. I find that does help. And I think if we got rid of that, then that might be a weird thing, to never feel like there's a finality or closure to it. I think that all makes sense, what you're saying. And that's obviously a very normal thing, but it's not normal for everyone to get that much joy out of the process. So let's talk about that and go back to the start of year 12. Did you have a lot of pressure on yourself, or was there pressure from others? Like, what kind of expectations did you have on yourself? Or were you just like, I just love studying, I love the subjects I'm doing, I'm just going to give it my all? Like, what was the mindset going into year 12?
It's a bit of both. So there was lots of pressure, I guess, from, I guess, my peers I suppose, because I performed well in year 11 and also I continued performing well in year 12. So that idea that, when I woke up on the morning of the results, for example, like I got spam messaged. So there was that expectation, which was probably the hardest part. But for me, that only really hit in the week leading up to results coming out. So for the rest of the year, I just very much loved history. I loved Latin. I loved English. I loved drama. Those were all the subjects I did and their various forms. And so being able to do them for an entire year was really fun. And I found that it became more fun because I was able to, talk to my peers, and we were able to have our stupid jokes about history or ancient history or whatever. And so when it came to working, it wasn't so much of, oh, this is a slog, I want to sit down. It was, I'm going to do all this reading and all this work because I really enjoy it. And I found that especially with subjects where you can take it to the next level, like history, for example, there's always like another historical take. And so I got really into reading academic articles about Spartan vase painting, which was just so random, but it was just another outlet. And that was what really kept me engaged, is I could do this really extension stuff and extend my knowledge of a topic in an area that I was really interested in. And it's still like relevant. And you still, if you sit down in your ancient history exam and you start writing this really complex stuff about different Spartan vase painters, which no one's heard of, like which you can't even find pictures of online, which only exist in like academic literature, the marker's gonna love it. So it was like both fun for me in a stupid way because everyone had a bit of a laugh over how much I loved Spartan vases, but also helpful for my studies. So yeah, I was driven both by my love of the subjects, and also there was a sense of, I wanted to come out at the end and I guess meet some of those expectations, but also not feel like the HSC had won. I don't know, in a weird way. Like I didn't want the HSC to beat me. So it wasn't competitive against other students. It was more so against this grueling process, which is the entire final year.
So I just a couple of points to clarify. You did include Spartan vases in your HSC exam?
I actually did. I did. There was a question about Spartan art and culture. And I wrote so much about the Spartan vases in that one. Very rewarding.
That's awesome. And what about, like, do you think, obviously that in that case, it did kind of pay off. Do you think your mindset was like beyond just, oh, this could be a differentiator in the exam? You were more just like, oh, this is so interesting, I like reading up on it. Was it always met with a kind of practical application element, in the sense that, just like with that example, you could actually use that in the exam? Were you always thinking that way? It was in the back of your mind, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't keep reading on this because this is not that related to the syllabus dot points, for example?
Yeah. So for history, I always work to the syllabus dot points. And so like there always was a sense that something I was reading was useful, like the dot point on, Spartan cultural production or whatever. And then the same with like other subjects so other history subjects, I always stick to the what I had to know. And sometimes I would find that my sort of study breaks would be reading something that wasn't so related. And I could justify that because I thought, oh, I did so much study. And then like now I'll read a random article about, I don't know, something completely unrelated to history, just because I'd find that interesting. So there was always a sense that I was always trying to find an extra bit of detail, especially in ancient, because there's just a lot less information often. Trying to find that extra bit of detail, which could work for me and also keep me interested.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think that practical side of things is very important. But as you say, I think it's really nice to hear that your interest in the subject was kind of the driving force behind it, right? A lot of students don't have that. They feel like every subject is a slog and that they're not enjoying it. Do you have any advice for students who are in that situation where they're not necessarily passionate about every subject that they're doing?
Yeah. So I experienced that because I did maths up until year 11, and I never did my homework until like year 10. I always just kind of float along, didn't do much study either. I just like go into the exam and wing it a bit. And obviously, like, I didn't like the subject because I felt out of my depth, and I didn't perform that well because I didn't know anything. And then about halfway through year 10, one of my teachers actually started checking my homework. And because I am, scared of being called out, I made sure I started doing my homework. And interestingly enough, I found that from then on, and then also through year 11, I wasn't like viciously hating maths, or I wasn't as switched off as I had been before. Like, I'd turn up to, like in year 11, I'd turn up to class, and like I was sitting in like the front row, doing my little notes, like talking to the teacher, trying to engage, showing her my work. And obviously my marks improved, commensurate to that work. And obviously at the end of the year, I still dropped it because I wanted to pick up extension, Latin and history extension, which I both like was incredibly passionate about. But I found that I didn't actually hate it. And the marks I produced, whilst they probably could have been better, I still didn't do like an excessive amount of study or work. I did my homework and then maybe a little bit extra leading up to the exams, were actually much better. So what my tip is, as I'm not sure it will work for everyone, but it's along the lines of just try and give it a genuine go at doing some of the work, especially if you feel like it's switched off, and get going on that probably as early as you can. Like if you're in year 10 and you haven't been doing any work up until now, do a little bit of that homework. Try and begin to engage with your teachers as well, because they're usually really passionate, even if you feel like they're switched off or they're mean, especially as you come into the later years, especially in the later years, they begin to treat you more as an adult. So in year 12 or year 11, you will be able to start, having a few more chats with your teachers, which aren't about your subject, just at the beginning or end of class. And so engage with them and try and develop a passion, as hard as that may sound. And if you find that you're doing a subject which you absolutely hate, like actually genuinely consider whether you should be doing that subject, even if someone's telling you have to do it. Like I found that whenever I was like, oh yeah, I dropped maths, people were like, Luke, what are you doing? Try and find what works for you. There's quite a bit of scope in terms of what HSC subjects are offered. And so yeah, do some work. If that doesn't work out, reconsider and talk to your teachers.
Yeah, that's solid advice. And you mentioned earlier that, the year, notwithstanding your interest in your subjects and your passion towards those subjects, you did mention that it was a grueling year, right? And the other point that you've just made there is that you weren't doing maths, and that is relatively uncommon, I suppose, especially for someone who does as well as yourself, like who got 99.9. Usually there's like an extension to maths in there, right? That tends to be quite common. It's not everyone, obviously, but good on you for going against the grain there and resisting that. But one thing that I think is worth kind of probing into is, how did you go about studying for the humanities? Because I always found, at least with maths, it provided a really nice structure. You get home, you do 2 to 3 hours, depending on what level of maths you're doing, 2 to 3 hours of practice questions, and you get that done. And then you might do an hour to 2 of the other subjects, right? That's how I approached it. And I liked that maths gave me that structure. But if I just took that away, I feel like I would be quite lost and I might not have that structure. So what was your process for studying on a day-to-day basis? What did a typical afternoon/night look like in terms of what you were doing, when you were doing it, and how long you were doing it for?
So one thing with humanities is it always can explode beyond the reasonable limits of how much you should be studying, because, as you know, every one of the humanities subjects just has so much stuff you could possibly tap into. As I said, history, there's always another take. There's always another point that can be made. There's always another historian to pull out. In Latin, you can always find that extra bit of analysis to make about Cicero, or read about that extra grammatical construct. And in English, again, there's always more analysis you can pull out and different techniques or whatever. So what I found is I had to, for the history ones, I had to stay focused. So that was, study would be doing things like getting through my syllabus dot points. And I had a really lengthy document at the end, which had kind of useless stuff at the big top, which was all the notes I'd taken throughout the year under syllabus dot points. And then the really important for the essay subjects below, which was I had essay plans after essay plans after essay plans. So I had as many possible takes as I could on each syllabus dot point in their essay plan format, which I found was a really helpful way to structure all the content, because there's going to be so much. So if I focus it down to individual questions, which are broad enough to cover most of a dot point, or if I have like 2 or 3 questions for a dot point for a really big one, then in my head, when I get a question, I just have that immediate structure where I say, this is my general, like really broad thesis about, if it's like how significant. And this is the sort of paragraphs I'd make. And under that, going into finer and finer detail as I approach the exam, here's like specific facts or statistics or historians' quotes and dates to get down to it. And similarly with English, what I found I had to do to get into the right, mindset and get everything down pat was, I know a lot of people go into English exams with a prepared essay or something which they want to modify. What I really tried to practice is getting a question, like a past paper question, and then just having all I knew about a text in my brain and trying to come up with an essay plan in like 5 minutes, nothing fancy, just like scribble down a thesis, scribble down my topic sentences for 3 paragraphs or whatever. And then if I want to keep going, then scribble down some evidence I would use for each one of those. So it was quite a fluid sort of process. It didn't involve as much, strict, like this is how I'm going to answer a question. It was, how can I adapt really quickly? How can I train myself to adapt to a question which could come out of completely left field? And that's something I found really helped, because I still did write essays in advance, which I thought were really strong ones, which I could use for a variety of questions. But I also had more than one, for example, covering different areas of text. And also I made sure I had extra stuff, like extra quotes, extra knowledge just behind there, just in case. And I found in my HSC, for example, for the common mod question, which wasn't even that bad, I found that I sat down and I didn't feel too prepared for it, but I was able to, on the spot, begin to work what I had and adapt to that question, because I couldn't just go and read my notes and pull out something completely new. I had to work with what I had. And so having practiced that, I found that I was flexible enough to turn what I thought was perhaps inadequate level of knowledge into a stronger, or obviously a strong enough response. So yeah, an afternoon might involve coming home, and I'd always kept a diary. In my case, it was a digital one. And I would have written down throughout the day as I went through my subjects, sort of either work that had been directly given to me or work that I really thought during the lesson, oh, this is something I should work on, whether that be a practice response or getting some extra detail for an essay, or for Latin, of course, it was pretty clear cut. For the first half of the year, it was essentially just lines of translating. And then the second half, it was bits of getting analysis for each section. And then I didn't really, interesting enough for me, I didn't really have a strict study plan or a strict study timetable. I did, at the end of the day, like I'd sit down and do 5 minutes writing, or thinking over what I needed to do tomorrow, and the same in the morning. But I gauged it, how much work I need to spend on a subject as I went. And I'd sit down to study, and I would just go through the list of things I'd written down, as well as if something popped up as I was working. So that was during most of the year. And then by the HSC, in the lead up to my exams, one of the unavoidable facts of history is you have to know lots of stuff and content. And so there was a lot of memorization there as well. That was just stuff about like statistics, essay plans, dates, quotes. And so all in all, it was trying to get home, get through what I'd written down, and anything else that I'd thought of earlier in the day, and keep it sort of like a methodical, always working, like not slowing down too much. I think there was probably like a week after the trials where I didn't do much work at all. and then getting back into it to try and keep chugging away so that I have detailed notes, which I can always refer back to.
Yeah, great. No, thank you for that elaboration on it. I think that will help a lot of people who are in a situation where they normally, don't know how to structure their study and what to do, especially if they're not doing something like maths or something that's a little bit more regimented. But a couple of follow-ups there. You mentioned a digital diary. Were you using like an app for that?
Yeah, so I had an iPad, and it was kind of like a Cheats digital diary where I was writing with my Apple Pencil, so it was like a physical one, but just on my iPad, and I was just using Notability, which when I bought it was like a one-time purchase, but now is a subscription, which is such a scam. And then also I found on my laptop itself I would set like Apple reminders for each of my assessments. And I'd also have like one of those things, how you can put them on your desktop, those like countdown things, just so I had them both, because that obviously on my laptop desktop screen didn't sync across my devices. So I could always check my exam timetable. And interestingly enough, for those countdowns, I always set it so it was midnight of the day before. So especially for assessments. So I didn't think that I had more time, because I thought, if I haven't finished it by the day before, I'm not in a good spot.
That's smart.
You're trying to get it done in advance.
In advance. I like that. That's good, because otherwise you will just, drag it out and you'll wait till the very last minute if you're like me. So I like kind of playing tricks like that. And I think that's important though. Talk to us about preparation before assessments. Like you've just mentioned there, you didn't want to leave it right till the last minute. So what was the process when you got an assessment notification, or then when trials came and then the HSC? What was the extent of your preparation? How important was it to start really early, and were you starting early? Was it different across the different subjects?
So I was always on top of it a lot. So really starting early. So I did 2 major works as well, both essays, one in drama and one in history extension. And what I found was for both of them that I was finished with writing these quite substantial works. So my history extension one was 2,500 words, and my drama one was 3,500, I think. And so I found that I was finished like weeks in advance. So I just had time where other of my friends were, furiously writing, where I just didn't even look at it for like a week or 2 weeks. And I remember, I think even for my drama one, when I got my trial mark back, I like looked at the mark, skimmed through the feedback, and then just like didn't do anything for like a week. And then I went back and thought, all right, now I'll start editing it. And then I had it finished 2 weeks before it was actually due. And the same for history extension and for all my assessments, so I'd usually get the question in class. I'd immediately get the due date down, as I said, on reminders and on my screen. And then if it was like an essay question I had to write, I'd usually just copy it immediately into a Word document. And then I guess as early as possible, I would start. So that meant at first, for writing lots of essays, that probably meant going into a Word document, as I said, and just dropping a bunch of spam in there. So that might be like massive quotes from an article I'd read, or a bunch of gibberish ideas which didn't make much sense, or like a dot point plan of essay structure, and trying to get going as soon as possible, so that I always had a reasonable buffer between when it was due and when I actually had it finished. And especially if it depends on the assessment, but sometimes we had the chance to submit drafts. That was really good, because I would have a more complete draft to submit. So if my friends were just like had written something which was pretty ad hoc just to meet the draft deadline, that's good. Obviously, it's better than not doing anything, because getting feedback is always good. But if I had a full essay, which I'd done a bit of work on and refined a bit, I was always going to get feedback which ultimately more helpful to me. So yeah, getting on the ball, on top of it, and not trying to kid myself into thinking that I had more time than I really did, because 2 weeks is if you have 2 week deadline. At least we did at my school, or submission warning. 2 weeks isn't that long of a time. And so I found that if I'd done it after like a week or a week and a half, I felt really chilled out by the time of submission. And there wasn't any of that last minute rushing, hurrying. It might be like the night before I would, do another read through, make sure everything sounded fairly normal, and then just submit it. Get the night. We got like a nice little animation thing whenever we submitted. It was like
fireworks,
confetti or something.
Yeah,
confetti. Getting on top of things early.
It's all well and good to say that you need to prepare early for an assessment or an exam, but a lot of people are probably thinking, well, that's way easier said than done. So my question to you is, how did you actually develop that habit? How did you develop the discipline to get an assessment task and do it straight away so that you're not in the position that 95% of students are, which is that the night before they are having a really late night, finishing up, doing the editing, and they haven't had a chance to get all of those rounds of feedback that you've been receiving because you were so on the ball. So how do you actually develop that skill or habit? And are there any tips? Like, do you just set an alarm, a reminder straight away? And how did you actually ensure that you were doing that throughout year 12?
I think the habit developed pretty naturally as I went along, because I always really wanted to succeed in my subjects all the way through. So from year 7, or even, you could say from primary school, I always really wanted to give it my all and succeed. And so I began to work out as I went through the years that there were certain times where I did succeed, and there were certain times where I didn't succeed. And a pretty clear indicator of a time when I did succeed is when I was on top of it and on the ball. And another thing that really pushed me to this sort of method was I was really busy in year 12. So I did a lot of extracurricular. I remember one time in term 2 or something of year 12, I had so much stuff to do. I was doing stuff for cadets. I was doing stuff for school leadership. I was part of the stage crew for a musical, and I also had an English assessment. And so I was kind of forced into a situation where if I didn't get started early, it would be impossible for me to finish because I was just that busy, and I had all the things after school and the rest of it. So I guess I kind of forced my own hand there in terms of getting into a good study habit, because and that was also throughout the rest of my time at school as well. So also in year 10, year 11, and before that, I was always trying to get involved in things outside of my studies. And so alongside my desire for success, there was also this understanding that, this evening I'm getting home at 6 p.m. And so I have a shorter period of time. And also, I also put the burden on myself that I always wanted to sleep well, especially during year 12. So my days were fairly strictly 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. In terms of my sleep schedule. Obviously, 30 minutes over wasn't like the end of the world for me, because I just thought as long as I'm getting around 8 hours, that meant that I understood that I had a time frame which was surprisingly limited, because I had those hours. I had after 10 p.m. essentially knocked out, and then after 6 a.m. that's just like stuff getting ready for school, having breakfast, getting on the train or whatever. And so understanding that I had to be very economical with my time made me work towards getting onto deadlines earlier and putting in the work early rather than staying up really late. And so I think that's just in terms of what do you prioritize for year 12, or what do you prioritize for your studies? For me, I prioritize sleep, and I prioritize getting involved in things outside of academics. And I also prioritize academics. And because I really wanted to balance all three of those, that meant that I naturally worked up habits which supported all three of those. And in terms of prioritize, I'm saying find what you really enjoy doing. And because I enjoy doing all three of those things, and so I wanted to prioritize them, I had to get on top of the ball. And also, I guess there was also a sense of, I understand that when I leave things to the last minute, I don't feel great, and it doesn't make my life any easier. And I was always very pragmatic in that sense, that I did want to make my life as easy as possible, especially in year 12.
Yeah, that all makes perfect sense. The faster you can actually commence a task, the easier it's obviously going to be. But what you just said there just made me think, it does take a certain level of self-awareness to understand, like, oh, hang on, I know myself. I'm not the best version of myself when I'm really stressed and I don't feel good about myself. I think that's a really important piece of it, is being able to foresee how you're going to feel about yourself if you don't do it straight away, and actually then being able to act on that. So that's obviously a great skill set, and just to have that awareness of how you feel when you do or don't do something in a certain way. I think that's a really important element there. Now, something you've mentioned, and we talked about the Spartan, vases and so forth, but you have mentioned a couple of times, including that example where you've done this external research. You've looked at articles and journals, and I'd love for you to elaborate on that, because I think that's a key way to differentiate yourself across a multitude of subjects, including English as well. So what was the extent of that? Was that something you found yourself doing all the time, that you were always reading up on these extra articles? And then what was your process for extracting that and using it in your own work?
I wasn't always reading up on this. This was more so later in the year. So as the year's going, obviously I'm just trying to learn the basics. And that's really important, because if I didn't know, what was, for example, my modern history teacher did PowerPoint slides. If I didn't know that, but I didn't know what was in the slides, which was like the general detail and some specific detail about the subject I'm studying, then, I'd be completely out of it. But in the latter stages, as I said earlier, as I've been on top of getting my work done, and I've been on top of doing my notes, even if sometimes I was quite inefficient with my notes, I'll admit. For example, at the start of the year, I was handwriting them, which I really recommended. Then I got my handwritten notes and typed them up. And then I turned those typed up notes often into essay plans or other sort of plans. So it wasn't quite inefficient, but I guess it helped me learn it in many ways, because I was getting that, really working that info into my head. So as I'd got the general basics down, as in the lead up to exams, I could really do some extension reading. And what that would look like is even things, surprisingly, for history, like Wikipedia, not like being, the fool who believes everything on Wikipedia, but even just having like a skim read over an article. And then like, if there's something which has a citation, going and looking at the citations and reading through that, or putting in a few general sort of search terms into JSTOR to try and find articles. And this is something I found has also given me an edge already as I'm about to commence uni, because I already have quite good processing skills for reading lots of information and whittling it down and trying to find the right sort of sources, especially in a subject like law. And I'm also majoring in history. So being able to consume these really extensive readings and pull out what's really matters is something that will help you later on. Another example of these sort of extension readings would be in English, where I really loved Mod B, because it's about critical study. So you do need to bring in some sort of critical lens and some sort of higher order lens. What I really loved was going to find not necessarily people who had written criticism about my text, though I did read some of that as well. I read articles about my text, but also finding philosophers in the same genre. So my text was a postmodernist one, analysis of the floating world. And so finding postmodernist philosophers who were obviously part of that, intellectual movement, and trying to see, can I draw a link here between this text and like Michel Foucault or something like that, something really crazy that, like a link which others may not have drawn. And so being able to experiment with these higher order ideas was also really fun, because I remember once I was reading about a few different postmodernist philosophers, and I remember once sitting going, yes, when I found this beautiful quote from Lacan or something, which just perfectly worked with what I was trying to say about analysis of the floating world, because they are part of the same intellectual thing. And I think it made it more real. Like when you say that the text you're studying is postmodernist, what does that even mean? When I was actually reading postmodernists who weren't writing about this text, it was the ideas were working together, the concepts were working together. Yeah, using things like JSTOR, even just general Google searches for academic sources or sources which do lead to or have proper citation to other academic sources is really helpful. Yeah, for those extension readings.
Yeah, that's great advice. And that's something that a lot of the high achievers tend to do. And that's why I asked the question, because if you can get used to just doing, you can start with a simple Google search, like you said, read your summaries, go to your Wikipedias. But then if you can go the next level and go to something like JSTOR or even Google Scholar, I find is a good one to get you started. That'll give you lots of links and you just type in your text name or whatever you want to research. And then maybe doing a couple of other keywords, like for instance, an artist, the floating world, postmodernism, you put in something like that, and then you go to those things and you start to figure out the process, and you get good, as you said, at reading the whole thing and then actually extracting, a couple of key points that you can work into your piece. So I think that's a really key thing that a lot of the highest achievers will do. So anyone watching, even if you don't consider yourself a high achiever, you should be doing as much as you can that resembles what a high achiever would do, right? To give yourself the best shot. So that is a really good practical thing that you can all be doing,
especially in that, as I said, in the later stages. So don't because otherwise you'll just feel out of your depth if you're immediately going on to something hyper specific about a text and you still haven't learned what the plot is or something, or the themes are. So in the lead up to your trials, and if you're doing an assessment about a particular, like an essay about a particular part of it, in the lead up that in particular, then putting in that extra detail.
Yes. Yeah. Well said. So obviously the order is important, and you'll just confuse yourself if you start with a really complex, journal or article online versus just understanding the key themes and the plot. So that's a great point. Let's move. I just want to finish on a couple of practical tips that you might have for people doing history specifically. Obviously, you got a state rank in both of those histories, modern and ancient. So we'd love to know what you were doing exactly in the few weeks before the HSC. Let's just use that as an example. And then I'm sure that applies to a similar extent for trials. Before the HSC, what were you doing in terms of past papers? You talked about syllabus dot points and having this big doc, but I would love to know more about those essay plans, what's actually in them, how thorough are they, how much were you memorizing? Anything on that would be super helpful.
Yeah, so in the lead up to the trials and HSC, there were, I'll be honest, it was a lot of memory work. So for modern and ancient, for the essay subjects, I had essay plans for just about as many questions as you could think of, and some of them even inconceivable, like ones for really specific dot points, which you don't think they would ever ask for unless they were being really mean that year. And then so I had those which usually had the 4 paragraphs or whatever, usually no introduction, because for history introductions are fairly standard. And then I'd have my topic sentence, and then whatever statistics, quotes, facts, and maybe a bit of a content note if I needed it. But always generally in terms of my paragraph structure, I would have made it so it flowed in my head in terms of what I was writing. And then so I had that on a doc, and what I was doing was essentially I would go from the top of the doc and I would look at the question and I'd try and write out a paragraph. Not write out, sorry, write out the dot points of the paragraph with the statistics, quotes, facts, dates. And then I would scroll down, and if I'd forgot something or missed a quote, missed a statistic, I'd add that in, and then I'd do the next paragraph, and I'd just go down the doc and then down the doc and then down the doc until it was all up there. And then for the non-essay part of it, for short answers, firstly, I did a ton of practice responses throughout the year. I remember once actually feeling guilty as I pressed send on the practice response button to one of my history teachers. But in the direct lead up, I think by that point, I'd done so many practice responses that I was doing fewer, which may have been may have been a miscalculation. I'm not sure. Wow. It didn't harm me too much. But by that point, I was also doing I set up some Quizlet sets with dates and statistics and quotes. and I was going through those because I found that I didn't feel it necessary to memorize a short answer question, like a 5 marker, a 10 mark. I didn't feel it as necessary to memorize the exact structure of that. So I always trusted myself to be able to respond and pull the facts out of my brain. And so these were pretty bulky sets with usually essentially that whole subject essentially, but condensed into the really important bits. And then I had a chance to do some mock papers at my school, which I enjoyed doing, and I put myself through the ring of fire after trials and before the HSC, which was in 5 days. I did 8 HSC exams under timed conditions and got them all marked by teachers. Wow. Which I remember at the end of that thinking, now the HSC is going to be really easy, because that was actually terrible. Never do 2-3 hour papers in a day. But I'm not sure about maths, but don't do it for I did history and Latin in one day, and by the end of it, I think my hand was giving up, but it was very strong. It was very strong, and I never had tired hands during the HSC. I know people who got away with doing a lot less work than I did, who still did reasonably well, but in the end, that was more so, I think, in terms that was luck in many ways, because you never know what the questions are going to be. And interestingly enough, in my modern exam I did conflict in Europe for one of my essays, and both the questions last year were incredibly broad. It was basically choose your own adventure of questions. And I remember at the end of it feeling a bit disappointed in the sense that you didn't actually need to know as much detail as I knew about the entire syllabus. Like, you could have gone in with a lot less, as I know my friends did, and write really good essays because they were just that broad. But you never know if that's going to be the case, because on the flip side, it could be a hyper-specific question, like about gulags or something, if you were doing Russia, which no one would be prepared for. So I'd say practicing the boring stuff, so getting it all memorized, and then also make sure you have the proper skills going in, because outside of all the memorizing and having all the statistics and thousands of whatever in your head, it will be important that you know how to respond on the day. And so you've done the practice responses in advance, you've gotten feedback on how you write them, and the more you do, the higher chance is you're going to encounter something the same in your exam. For example, for me, in my mock exam, actually, I did there was one of the questions in the China section that I studied was about the Red Guards, and I wrote it in a certain way, submitted it, and I got feedback, and that was one of the few places where I lost marks in that mock. And the teacher wrote just a note saying, this was about the role of the Red Guard. You've described what they've done, but you haven't talked specifically about their role. And I sat down on my HSC exam, I opened up the China section, and what was one of the main questions? What was the role of the Red Guards? And so I just was able to immediately, my brain just flashed back to that, and I thought, oh, here we go, easy. So because there is, as wide and as much content as there are still syllabus points, and the question's always going to be linked to them. So if you do a wide variety of questions, and you have the requisite content knowledge, the requisite skills which you've just worked up over the whole year, you will be in a good place. Yeah,
that's awesome. I just have one follow-up, because I know you kind of glossed over it because you said it's pretty standard, but I'm sure a lot of people would like to know what you meant by it. An introduction for a history essay, you said they're pretty standard, but do you have a kind of go-to structure then? Is it a formulaic kind of approach there?
It's incredibly formulaic. So the intro is you just want to signpost all your ideas. So your first sentence should be, if it's a question asking for a judgment, it should be the judgment. So it's going to be your overarching thesis. And that's going to be very broad always. So it's like, how significant? Very significant. Not significant. Usually pretty significant, because they're asking a question about it. Fun fact. And then after that, you're just going to go through not in like a way which you're boringly listing. You have to make your language flow, and it has to sound nice, but just go through your topic sentences. So you want to have some sort of plan in your head in advance, whether you write that down on the paper, or if you already just, I often found that I didn't really need a plan because I'd memorized enough essay plans that I could just work it out in my head. But yeah, so just go through those 4 or however many, 5, whatever topic sentences, introducing them, each idea, and then the concluding sentence might just be, again, restate your overarching thesis in using a bit of different language. And the thing about history essays is, if you stick to that format and then in your paragraphs, you stick to a teal, as kind of formulaic as it is, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for an essay which is clear. And, you can include a bit of flair with your language, which isn't so much like a crazy metaphor, but might be, some nice specific terminology or, some specific detail. But what they want to do is see that you've got an argument, see that it's well reasoned and well argued, and see that you've got the content to back it up. And in that order in many ways, because the argument and having like a good judgment is in some ways more important than the content, and the content's just meant to support that judgment and act as like a, obviously an evidence for it. So I found that it came to me naturally, like the teal stuff, practicing it over time. So just make sure you get just so much into that habit that when you go to write your intro, you already know, all right, thesis, topic sentence, topic sentence, topic sentence, topic sentence, thesis again. And then when you go into your paras, it's just that simple, we're just going to go through and we don't have to think about it. We're just going to, write.
Very nice. So you would typically have about 4 to 5 body paragraphs for like a 20-mark essay?
Yeah, for history, they'd be 25 marks, but yeah.
25
usually
marks,
4. Yeah, usually 4. But if I think in my ancient exam, my essay was 5 paragraphs because I was feeling bold, putting myself under the time pressure.
Yeah, paid off. Right? Comes back to that preparation, I'm sure, and being efficient in the exam. Well, thank you so much, Luke. That's been really informative and very helpful, I'm sure, for everyone who's been listening. Have you got any final words of wisdom that you want to share to students about the year as a whole, or it could be beyond the HSC?
Yeah, I guess generally after your exams, don't attempt to post-mortem them and work out how you did. You'll never know. I thought I got like 50 in my ancient exam, and I thought I got like 33 in my English exam. And throughout the year, just try and enjoy it and don't get too stressed or pressed. Have your goals, be confident that you can achieve them, and do what works for you in the end. No one else can tell you what to do. I can't tell you what to do. I can tell you what I did, but your brain is your brain and you understand how it works.
Well said. Well, thank you again, Luke. Really appreciate you coming on, and thank you everyone for watching. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like and comment if you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one.